Overwhelm, how it nearly ended my career before it began and how I overcame it. Overwhelm can be a very big part of people's inner struggles. I find that with my coaching. So many people feel overwhelmed and have trouble dealing with all the things that they have to face each day. It can also be a very big part of people's financial struggles. And so I wrote about it in my book, Overcoming Financial Stress, How to Conquer Your Financial Fears and Create a Better Future. And so the story I'm about to tell you comes from that book. I thought, just for something different, I'll read an extract from this book. Now, the message that this story contains will certainly help you with your overwhelm. But if you find that it's a persistent problem, a really persistent problem, that might take a little bit more work. And so that might be better dealt with in a one-on-one basis. So let's have a chat about it and we'll fix that up for you, or help you fix it up for yourself. Now, what is overwhelm? Well, overwhelm is a situation where the demands of the situation are larger than our perceived resources. So we feel overwhelmed because we don't think we've got enough resources to deal with the situation demands. So by resources, I mean energy, I mean emotional strength, inner strength, I mean powers of concentration, all the things that might be required to deal with some situation. And I use the word perceived carefully because sometimes we have resources that we don't think about, we don't realize that we've got, and so we actually generally have much more in the way of resources than we believe. And so once we become aware of those greater resources, the sense of overwhelm can be reduced. I use the analogy of a production line. Imagine you're on a production line and your job was to screw tops on jars after the product was put into the jars. And if the production line's going at the conveyor belt's going at the right speed, you're going to be able to put the caps on the jars as required and keep up with the demands of the machine. If the machine goes too slowly, you're probably going to get a bit bored, lose concentration, and probably mess up the job. If the machine goes too fast, of course, you can't get the caps on. You'll probably knock some over off the line, and before you know it, there'll be a catastrophe. You certainly won't get the job done. So the machine going too fast, or the conveyor belt moving too fast, is the equivalent of being overwhelmed. You just can't keep up with the demands of the task at hand. So a story that I use to illustrate overwhelm and how I overcame it in my own life goes back to when I was at university. I was doing an undergraduate degree in civil engineering. And so just referring now to my book, I was in third year of my undergraduate civil engineering degree. I've been suffering from ill health for some years following a motor accident. However, I was finally feeling really great. And the last thing that I really wanted to do was spend my entire time sitting behind books, studying. I hope you can identify with that. So I let my hair down and skipped lectures and generally had a good time. It was really great to feel good again after several years of ill health. The engineering degree that I was doing was a very intensive course, and it had about 34 hours of lectures, practical classes and design classes each week, with an enormous amount of material to be handed in regularly. Somehow I managed to scrape through all the work that had to be submitted each week, but hadn't done all the necessary study for the exams. Finally, however, with the end of the year exams approaching, I had to face up to the fact that things were getting pretty serious. At that time, I'd only had one examination period each year, and with this looming up in front of me, I suddenly realised that I had too much to learn for the time remaining. So I would sit down each night trying to study, all the time filled with fear and worry about failing. To fail would have been a tragedy because I'd done well in the previous 2 years, having never failed a subject, and had my heart set on being a structural engineer, a branch of civil engineering. I dreamt of designing major bridges, structures that would benefit many thousands of people every day, structures that would survive long after I'd gone. I felt very passionate about the thought of designing bridges, and I happened to notice a lot of calendars, or when they talk about showing cities on calendars, they always show bridges, and I thought I'd love to be able to say I designed some of those bridges. When I tried to study, my worry became so intense that I couldn't really concentrate on the material that I was studying. I'd find my mind wandering about what I would do if I failed, about the indignity of it all, about the costs involved and so on, thinking about everything but the task at hand. Maybe you can identify with that, particularly if you're feeling overwhelmed. Weeks went by and I made very little progress. My fear and worry were so great. Eventually, after weeks of useless attempts to study, I awoke to discover that there was really only 6 weeks left until the first exam. It was the desperation of this position that I came to a major realisation. The realisation that I couldn't possibly expect to pass the exams on only 6 weeks' work. After all, there were 11 3-hour exams to be held over a period of 22 days. With 6 weeks to go, I had less than half a week to prepare for each exam, a whole year's worth of work material. So eventually, facing up to that, I painfully decided that I could no longer worry about whether I would fail or not. I concluded that it was actually a foregone conclusion, that I'd fail. The only unknown was just by how much I would fail by. Confronted by this shocking realisation, I decided to change my goal. Instead of aiming to pass, which I didn't believe was possible under the circumstances, I set the objective of failing by as little as possible. So each time I sat down to study, every time my fear of failing popped into my mind, I reminded myself that this was a foregone conclusion and that my goal was simply to fail by as little as possible. I also kept reminding myself that I was doing my best in a difficult situation, and that was all I could do. If this was not good enough, well, so be it. Amazingly, this change of perspective took the pressure off me, and I found that I then became able to relax a lot more, and so was able to study much more effectively. I also decided that I didn't want to be fresh and bright as a button during the university vacation period that would follow the exams. I felt that I hadn't really earned this, as I'd had my holiday during the year. So I resolved to allow only 4.5 hours for sleep each night, and then I would study every spare minute available, allowing me minimal time for the basic tasks of life. I knew that working like this would leave me feeling pretty exhausted when the exams were over, but I believed that this was what I actually deserved under the circumstances. Somehow, I was able to stick to this tough regime for the whole 9 weeks, including the exam period, principally because I was far more relaxed, having taken the pressure off myself by no longer striving to pass, simply striving to fail by as little as possible. When the exam period arrived, I only allowed myself 1 hour from the completion of one exam before I was back studying for the next exam. Once the exam was over, I pushed that subject completely out of my mind so I could move on to the next one. I allowed no time for reflection on how I went. If I wondered about this at all, I would remind myself that I probably failed and that I was only trying to fail by as little as possible. Naturally, my expectations were low when the exam results were finally posted. However, to my utter amazement, I ended up doing far better than I could have ever imagined under the circumstances. I passed every subject, even getting honours in a few of them. By reframing my situation in this situation and taking the pressure off, I ended up achieving a goal that I considered way beyond my reach. It was absolutely astounding, and I was immensely grateful to the universe for helping me through this crisis. Incidentally, I ended up graduating at the end of 4th year with honours and did go on to be largely responsible for the design of some major award-winning bridges and other structures. So despite the challenges that I faced in my 3rd year, my dreams actually did come true. My major problem had been, of course, that every time I sat down to study, I would dwell on the big picture of whether I passed or failed, rather than focusing on the task immediately to hand. I was spending all my time worrying about the outcome and insufficient time on the actions required to achieve the outcome. This naturally created a sense of overwhelm. Does this sound at all familiar to you? Overwhelm occurs when we are chunking too high. Chunking refers to the amount of information, to the level of detail we're considering. For example, if I chunk up from motor car, I might be talking about transport systems. I'm becoming more general. If I chunk down from motor car, I might be talking about a steering wheel. I'm becoming more specific. So the solution to overwhelm is to chunk down, to consider greater specificity. In particular, to focus on the task at hand. Ask yourself, what can be done to improve my situation this week, this day, this hour, this minute? If something can be done, focus all your attention on it. If nothing can be done, focus all your attention on whatever else you're doing, giving your mind a rest from your worries and anxieties. So this lesson was invaluable to me many years later when I was facing my financial challenges, and it stood me in good stead throughout my life and helped me deal with overwhelm many, many times. So I hope you find this useful. As I said, if you find that your problems are persisting, maybe they're better dealt with a one-on-one coaching session, having a chat. So certainly contact me if you would like to do that.